Over. Roger. Out. I could see the men moving around the houses, and I double-timed forward with my CP group. A tank loitered beside a house, and the commander called for doughboys to precede it down the narrow main street. Civilians were being lined up with their hands high in the air. The GIs were making a thorough job of it. Everyone not in OD uniform must keep their hands high above their heads. The dull grey light of dawn illuminated the landscape. The soldiers moved quickly through the town. Here and there a building showed the marks of the night's shelling. Somewhere near the centre of town, 2 houses were enveloped in smoke from smouldering flames. The sounds of doors being broken down and single shots dispensing with locks informed the awed civilians that they had done wrong in locking their houses. I continued down the left side of the street, keeping close to the buildings for protection should snipers open up. We reached a battered church on a small square, and I looked at my map. This was where Heimbach ended and Weiss began. The forward riflemen had almost completed taking our second objective, and there was no resistance. I thought of the Bürgermeister. The poor man had been telling the truth, and no one believed him. The first platoon took 2 sleepy-eyed, submissive prisoners from a basement. The 2D platoon sent a yawning German soldier, clad only in his trousers, running down the debris-littered street toward our rear. 2 Frenchmen in French army uniforms chartered wildly. "Mon Dieu, c'est trop bien. Les Américains sont ici. Merci, merci." A procession of 20 half-dressed Wehrmacht soldiers moved rapidly down the street toward the rear, goaded by loud shouts from their guard, Private First Class Joseph Weylant, and GIs whom they passed. Weylant's face was wreathed in smiles, and his arms and pockets were loaded with German pistols. We came abreast of the prisoners. "Found 'em all in a cellar," Weylant called to us. "I got beaucoup pistols. Want a pistol, Captain?" He tossed me a shiny Mauser Point .32 automatic. A pistol was the ultimate souvenir for souvenir-hunting GIs. We continued down the street. The buildings began to thin out into single houses, and I looked at my map. We were near the edge of Weiss and about a mile from Bendorf-Seine, our third objective. A curving blue line on the map indicated the Seine River. That thin blue line would be the enemy's defence, I thought. Some inner sense told me that this carefree offensive could not last much longer, but the laughing shouts of the happy GIs around me would not let me be afraid. I joined in their laughter, and men shouted, "This is a hell of a war!" We reached the last house in the town, and the lead platoons held up to reorganize. An orchard with slightly rising ground stretched before us on the left of the road. Beyond that rise would be the next town, and perhaps the enemy defence. The platoons reorganized, and the big tanks crawled noisily into position. Someone in F Company fired a bar at 3 fleeing Germans in an open field on the right of the road. I signalled forward, and the scouts moved out, their rifles held in readiness for whatever might happen. Don't scouts have fun? There's nothing between them and the whole German nation but the muzzles of their rifles. They get first choice of the liquor and the loot and the fraternizing. Everybody wants to be a lead scout. Like hell they do, brother, like hell. A brazen sun was shining now, but a low mist clung tenaciously around the blue hills to our front. The men moved quickly through the orchard. The scouts crossed the rise to the front. I expected at any moment to hear the dreaded sound of enemy fire, but the silence was broken only by the roaring motors of the tanks. The last men in the forward platoons crossed the crest of the small hill. They should be almost inside the first houses of Bendorf now, I thought. I halted the CP group in a sunken trail running across the crest of the hill and told Junior to ask for reports from the assault platoons. Suddenly, a tank fired from somewhere to our front, and a big shell whirred low over our heads. A machine gun chattered. A round of tank fire ripped the limb from a tree above our heads. A burp gun said. We dropped to the cover of the sunken trail. The men behind us took cover in an abandoned quarry. The shells from the enemy tanks whirred close overhead, and small arms fire chattered loudly. I wondered if the assault platoons had been caught on the open face of the hill, or if they had succeeded in gaining the comparative safety of the houses. I took the platoon radio from Junior and called for Lieutenant Bagby. "I've got men in the first two houses," he said, "but we can't get any farther. Their tanks are on a wooded hill to the left of town, and they're blasting hell out of the houses." The artillery observer set up his radio, but the orchard obscured our view. I asked Bagby if he could adjust from where he was, and he said he would try. I was trembling slightly from excitement, but I was not deathly afraid as I had once been in the pillbox positions. The opinion often expressed among GIs that after any man was wounded once he was never any good in combat again did not hold true in my case. I was more calm than ever before, but I was also more cautious. 3 of our tanks were on the forward slope, and I wondered why the Germans did not knock them out. I attributed it to the screening effect of the trees in the orchard. One of the 2 rear tanks pulled up beside us. There was a deafening explosion, a burst of flame, and dirt and smoke blew back into our eyes. I thought for a second that the tank was hit, but then I realized that the gunner inside had fired the big 75. I heard Captain Calhoun tell Battalion that he was caught in the open field on the edge of the town. He was drawing SP fire from the same direction as we were, but it was small arms fire that had him pinned to the ground. I reported our situation. Lieutenant Bagby could not see the first 3 rounds of artillery. The observer called for a smoke round, but he still could not see it. I tried to call Sergeant Patton on the platoon radio, but he interrupted. "Send somebody to the left flank," he cried, distressed. "There's a whole bunch of kraut coming in on our left." I called back to Sergeant Barnes in the quarry, and his men moved quickly to the left and entered the first of 2 houses that stood beside the sunken trail to the left before the ground rose to the wooded hill. I could see them moving beyond the house into a garden before they were lost from sight. I motioned for the CP group to follow me, and we ran to the left, bending low lest our heads and shoulders show above the banks of the sunken trail. I had to get where I could see what was going on. We entered an open gate in a brick wall around the first house. 2 men investigated the house, but said they could see nothing from inside. I went into a small barn in the rear and climbed to a second-floor room that was filled with potatoes. Windows in the rear and on the right side afforded a clear view of the area to our front and right flank. The artillery observer began to adjust fire on the hill to our left front, from which the tanks were firing. Lieutenant Bagby reported that he had succeeded in getting all his men inside houses, but when they attempted to move across the open space between houses, they were smothered with small arms fire. Patton had some men still on the edge of town in the orchard. 2 men were wounded. He thought he could advance, however, if he could get the tanks to go with him. I tried to reach the tanks over the radio, but to no avail. Through the right window, I saw a man rise from a shallow dip in the ground and run toward one of the tanks. I saw that it was Patton. He held a hurried conversation with a tanker inside the turret, then ran back to the scant protection of the dip in the ground, a burst of enemy small arms fire following his path. "The goddamn tankers say they can't come forward," Patton panted over the stuttering platoon radio. "I can move in, if the tanks will come with me." I tried again to call the tank platoon leader on the battalion radio, but there was no answer, and Colonel Smith interrupted for a report on the situation. He said he was sending E Company around my left flank through the woods to hit the hill from which the tanks were firing. I told him I thought my 2D platoon would make it in a few minutes if I could get the tanks forward. He said E Company had already started forward, and he wanted them to continue. Sergeant Barnes reported over the 536 radio that his men were in the garden to the left of the barn where I was located. They had gotten there just in time to stop a flanking movement against Patton's men by about 25 Germans. They had pushed on to a 2-story villa beyond the garden, but a German tank had chased them out with direct fire. Several men had suffered scratches and bruises from falling plaster and glass, but no one was seriously hurt. I tried a 3rd time to get the tank platoon leader on the radio, but there was no answer. One of the headquarters men said, "I'll go tell him." It was Private First Class Sidney Fane, of Brooklyn, NY, a small Jewish boy who wore glasses and squinted when he talked. It was my first experience with the fact that Fine was afraid of nothing. He ran quickly across the intervening open space to the first tank, and I could see him rapping on the side of the tank to gain the attention of the crew. He left the tank and ran back toward us. The big tanks raced their motors and started forward. I wondered what magic Fane had used. He climbed the ladder to the barn loft, the pockets of his green fatigue trousers bulging with various items, which he seemed to have a mania for collecting. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told them you said they'd better get moving or you'd be down there and shoot hell out of them with a bazooka right smack in their tails," he said. I laughed. The fire from the infantry weapons suddenly increased. The forward platoons were beginning to roll. I heard F Company report to battalion that they had entered the town. E Company was meeting stiff resistance on the hill to our left, but was advancing slowly. Lieutenant Bagby said his men were going forward. Sergeant Patton's radio operator called for 2 litter squads, but the platoon was pushing forward. They had 10 prisoners. I could see men from Sergeant Barnes's platoon in the garden on my left, rounding up about 20 Germans. The artillery observer removed the long aerial from his radio, and I started forward with my CP group across the orchard. We passed 2 wounded men from the 2nd platoon. Both were hit in the leg and were waiting patiently for litter bearers. 2 walking wounded from the 2nd platoon passed us, going toward the rear. We entered a street that ran at an angle toward the highway, which entered the town on our right. A house and barn burned in a furious blaze of smoke and flame on the left side of the street. 2 Germans lay side by side in the middle of the street. One looked at us curiously as we passed. The other was dead. A horse broke out of the burning barn on the left, and we watched dumbfounded as a grey-haired old woman emerged from the flaming house. She caught the horse and led it, blindfolded, back into the barn, locking the gate behind him. The animal squealed in terror. Just as calmly she turned and re-entered the flaming house and locked the door behind her. "Maybe she's dying for dear old Adolf," someone said. We stopped in a house on the corner where the street joined the main highway. 2 sides of the house were gone from shell blasts of a Sherman tank. The rooms were a ruin of broken furniture and dust from crushed and fallen plaster. We paused while I called for a report from the platoon leaders. The men from my forward CP group began to search the debris in the building for valuables. "We're approaching the bridge across the river now," Patton's radio operator reported. "We can see the bridge from where we are." A deafening explosion rocked the shattered building, and its 2 remaining walls trembled. "They just blew the bridge to hell and back," the radio operator said. I reported to battalion that my men were at the bridge, and I heard F Company follow with a similar message. We moved again in the wake of the assault platoons, their path marked on either side of the street with gaping holes in the buildings where the big tanks had blasted the opposition. When I reached the bridge, the men from both assault platoons were gathered in a milling group. Some sat calmly on the sides of the remaining portion of the bridge, smoking cigarettes, while others laughed and joked with each other as they sauntered casually about the area. I listened half expectantly for enemy fire from beyond the fast-flowing stream to disperse the group, but no fire came. Private First-Class Wayland appeared on the other side of the bridge, waving a bottle of champagne. His pants legs were soaked to the knees, evidence that he had waded the shallow river to reach the other side. "Look what I got!" he yelled to the others. "There's a Kraut civilian over here who said he'd sworn he'd give a bottle of champagne to the first American to cross the river. Who wants to join my bridgehead?" I talked with the 4 platoon leaders and took stock of our casualties. The 1st platoon had 2 men wounded slightly, and 3 men from the 3rd would qualify for Purple Hearts without evacuation. The butt of Sergeant Patton's rifle had been shot away as he carried it on his shoulder, but he was uninjured. 4 of his men were wounded. A 5th, one of his assistant squad leaders, had been shot in the head by an enemy rifleman as he rounded the corner of a building and had died immediately. Battalion wanted to know if we could get our tanks across the river, but one look at the blown bridge was enough to know that it was impossible at this point. Captain Calhoun said there were no bridges to our right, and E Company had not reached the river yet. A concrete conduit rising a few inches above the level of the water stretched across the stream to the left of the shattered bridge. It would provide a dry crossing for the foot troops, but the tanks would have to wait until the engineers could bridge the stream. The steep banks on either side made it impossible for them to ford the obstacle. Colonel Smith arrived, and we studied our maps. The main portion of the town lay ahead of us beyond the stream. I should move Company G across a second stream, which joined the river 100 yards to our left front, directing my 3 rifle platoons up 3 separate streets leading to the outskirts of the town. There we should establish a defensive position, being prepared to move upon order to the crest of a wooded hill rising high against the sky beyond the village. We lined up in single file and crossed the conduit. I directed my 1st and 2nd platoons to deploy once again in an approach march formation after crossing, and they moved out across a wooded, marshy area leading to the second stream. The scouts advanced cautiously but rapidly, but there was no sign of the enemy. The bridge across the second stream had been partially demolished, making it impossible for the tanks to cross there even if they bridged the river, so I radioed the information to battalion. A towering castle with ancient stone walls stood guard over the junction of the 2 streams, its high towers ending picturesquely in the stone sides of a beetling cliff behind it. 4 men checked it for enemy stragglers. Lieutenant Bagby's 1st platoon moved up a side street to the right to take up their defensive position. The 2nd platoon continued up the narrow main street, lined on either side by closely grouped shops and dwellings. I saw by my map that the street broadened out as it climbed the high hill to the rear of the town, eventually becoming a highway which led across and beyond the hills to the rear. I sent Sergeant Barnes's platoon along a dirt road that curved to the left of the castle and would bring him abreast of the wooded hill which E Company would occupy on the opposite side of the river. I followed the 2nd platoon up the main street. Curious civilians lined either side of the street, some standing brazenly along the old walls of the buildings, others peering cautiously from behind closed windows. The street curved to the right as it climbed the hill, and I lost sight of Patton and his men. A moment later, the sound of rifle and machine gun fire echoed down the twisting street. Patton had evidently run into trouble. The buildings on either side of us disrupted the weak platoon radios, and I could not contact Sergeant Patton. We moved forward quickly, calling over the radio as we went, until we established contact. They had run into German machine guns in the last scattered houses of the town and were having a stiff fight. I said I would send our light machine guns to help, and called for them from the weapons platoon. They hurried up the street towards the sound of the firing. Battalion radioed a change of orders. The 1st Battalion had gone cross-country and captured Stromberg, a small town astride the high ridge to the southeast of Bendorf Sign. They were to continue the attack to the southeast and would need both platoons of tanks which we had been using. The tanks had found an undamaged bridge opposite E Company and were waiting for us there. I was to take my whole company along the route which my 3rd platoon was now traversing and move with the tanks to Stromberg. And quickly. The 1st Battalion was ready now to continue their attack. I tried to call the platoons, but I could contact only the 1st and 2nd, and Sergeant Patton said he did not know if he could disengage himself from the firefight. I told him to get out as quickly as he could. Then move back to the castle and follow us around to the left. You'll be the support platoon. If you can't get away soon, we'll start on up the hill without you. Just leave the Kraut. F Company will take care of them. We've got 3 prisoners in the basement of a house, Patton said, and we have to cross 100 yards of open field to get back out. We'll never make it with the prisoners. Roger, I answered. Do what you can. We moved back to the castle and followed the circuitous route around to the left. We overtook the 3rd platoon as they halted at an abandoned factory near the bridge where the tanks were crossing the river. I looked up at the high hill we must climb. Horseshoe curves in the ascending road gave it a mountain-like appearance. The side of the hill was almost vertical. It would be a fatiguing climb, even if we met no opposition, and determined enemy opposition might hold us up for days. The easiest way to climb the hill would be to ride, I observed, congratulating myself upon the intelligence of it, and we would stand almost as much chance against possible opposition if we rode as if we walked. I was beginning to ache from the day's walking, and I could tell by the expressions on the faces of the men that they were exhausted. We had walked over 5 miles as the crow flies already, and we certainly had not been riding crows. Also, it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it would not be long until night. I radioed my decision to battalion. We would ride the tanks up the hill and into Stromberg. The plan was agreeable with the 2 tank platoon leaders, but Captain Dan J. Manning, Jr., of Northampton, Mass., the E Company commander, cautioned me that the last of the German tanks had retreated up the hill not more than 15 minutes before. The information half frightened me, but I did not tell the tank platoon leaders lest they object to carrying the doughboys up the hill. The tankers had received a replacement for the lead tank that had hit the mine before daylight, and we now had 10 tanks. My second platoon had not yet joined us, so I radioed battalion to direct them to follow us on foot to Stromberg. We loaded on the tanks, and the tankers signalled that they were ready. Their treads churned up clouds of dust on the dirt road, and we began the ascent. Lieutenant Bagby rode on the first tank with 1 squad from the 1st platoon. I rode with the CP group on the 4th tank. The men laughed and joked, recalling thrilling experiences astride the big monsters on the dash to the Rhine River, evidently unconcerned with the thought that the huge hill to our front might prove to be a formidable enemy defence. I longed to share their jovial attitude, but I could not put the thought of the recent departure of the enemy tanks from my mind. They might wait in ambush at any one of the sharp horseshoe bends on the wooded hill, and literally blow us off the side of the hill. The big Shermans churned the dust with their treads, and their heavy motors echoed back and forth through the deep ravines in the surrounding hills. I hid my face in my hands. We could scarcely breathe for the dust. The road ran to the left for 200 yards before making its first abrupt turn to the right. I could see around the first curve and look down from my perch atop the 4th tank at the other tanks behind us, loaded with tired but alert GIs. The lead tank stopped at the first bend in the road to the left, and Lieutenant Bagby and his forward squad dismounted. They rounded the curve cautiously on foot until a soldier in the rear signalled all clear. The tank lunged forward and picked up its cargo. The long column started to move again up the precipitous side of the hill. The little town of Bendorf-Sayn lay far below us beside the winding silvery ribbon that was the river. The lead tank halted again when the road horseshoed to the right and the riders dismounted. They found holes in the road and probed for mines, but the suspected mines failed to materialize. We halted 2 more times before reaching a straight stretch of road which continued to the crest of the hill. In the distance, I could see the far edge of the woods. Alert eyes on every tank scanned the dense woods on either side of us for signs of the enemy. Lieutenant Bagby's tank halted again at the edge of the woods. "There's a farmhouse and some buildings ahead," he said over the platoon radio. "I'm going forward with 1 squad to investigate." We waited impatiently on the tanks. Someone dug out a chocolate bar from a K ration and offered me a bite. "Voulez-vous chocolat?" For the first time I realized I was ravenously hungry. We had not eaten since the early morning breakfast. My fear of an enemy defence on the high hill was gone now, for even if the enemy occupied the buildings ahead, we had safely ascended the hill. A fight now would be comparatively easy. The advance squad signalled forward, and the lead tank moved off. The farmhouse was on the edge of Stromberg. The squad had recognised the OD uniforms of other GIs. We turned the tanks over to the 1st Battalion. Our own battalion staff arrived closely behind us, and Captain Herbert C. Bird of Albuquerque, N-Mex, the battalion operations officer, designated areas of the town for each company to defend for the night. Sergeant Patton's platoon arrived, tired and dusty from the tiring uphill walk from Bendorf-Sayn. The prisoners were not with them. Company G today committed a war crime. They are going to win the war, however, so I don't suppose it really matters. I went with the platoon leaders on a hurried reconnaissance of our designated sector, and we set up a hasty defence for the night, chasing the civilians to their cellars and finding room in houses for every man. "There's an old man and his old lady in our CP who say they won't go to the cellar," Harms told me. "They say the Americans are here now, and there won't be any more boom-boom. Tell them either they get to the cellar or we turn them over to the MPs," I said. That did the trick. They evidently thought military police were the American equivalent of the Gestapo. I wondered what I would have done had they refused again to go to the cellar. The kitchen arrived with a hot supper. I ate quickly to allow time for a visit with the rifle platoons before dark, and moved from house to house, talking briefly with the men. They were tired but jubilant over the success of the day's attack. Everywhere there were little individual stories of today's war. I found myself becoming closely cemented to this new company. There always would be a spot in my heart for Company 1, but there would be a place now for Company G as well. The successful attack on Bendorf Seine had raised my spirits and given me a confidence in my personal ability in an attack which I had not had before, and an integral part of that new confidence was this group of dusty, weary, smiling men. I still could find no glory in war, but there was much less evil in a successful attack than in a perpetual defence or a retreat. It made you feel elated some way. I stopped longer at the house where the men from the squad of the sergeant who had been killed were preparing for the night. I had not known the sergeant personally, but to these men he was an important character in the little war that revolved around themselves. There was an undertone of sadness as they talked, but there was no bitterness. The sergeant had died like any one of them might die at any time. There was a war on, you know. An SP gun shelled the town during the night, but except for one shell that clipped off the corner of one of the buildings occupied by the 1st Platoon, they landed in the rear portion of the town. We had a hot breakfast early the next morning, and I was called to battalion for a reconnaissance. We would take over the defence of Naur, the town to the southeast, which the 1st Battalion had taken the afternoon before. The 1st Battalion would continue the attack to the next town, and then the regiment would await further orders. With Harms to serve as interpreter, I joined the reconnaissance party. We moved by jeep to Nauort along a road that ran astride the high ridge on which Stromberg was saddled. To our right we could see the high blue hills stretching on into Germany, and I thought that if the enemy had any artillery left, he would surely shell this road. Nauort was another sprawling farm village, but we succeeded in finding one house without a manure pile in the front door, and which battalion did not claim as their command post. The company arrived on foot from Stromberg with the news that they had been shelled twice on the open stretch between the towns, but there had been no casualties. I directed the platoon leaders to defensive positions around the northeast edge of the town, and they began to obtain billets in the outer fringe of houses. Our kitchen arrived and set up in the town gasthouse next door to my CP. I visited the battalion CP after supper. Colonel Smith had received the news that 2 armoured divisions had broken out of the Remagen bridgehead that morning, in what might prove to be the final drive across Germany. Resistance had been negligible, but the 2 spearheads had become confused after reaching a point several miles beyond the Autobahn and had run directly into each other. They would bivouac there for the night, but would continue the drive the next morning. Our regiment would follow the 9th Armoured for any mopping-up operations which might develop. The mission of establishing a bridgehead for the 3rd Army at Koblenz was no more. The 3rd was already across the Rhine. It had become clear that the 1st Army could have broken out of their bridgehead at almost any time, but they had been waiting for at least one of the other armies to cross. I brought the news back to my CP, and we telephoned the information to the platoons. We all were firmly convinced that the war was in its final stages, and could not possibly last much longer than 1 or 2 weeks. We loaded onto 2.5-ton trucks the next morning with Dernbach, a small town to the southeast 2 miles beyond the Autobahn, as our objective. The drive was slow over unimproved roads to avoid confusion with the rear elements of the armoured divisions, but we arrived shortly after noon. Our column halted beside a big building which was evidently a Catholic school or hospital on the edge of town. 2 middle-aged, pleasant-faced nuns walked toward one of the trucks which carried men from my company. A group of men was unashamedly relieving themselves beside the road. The nuns spoke in obviously rehearsed English. "We are so happy you have come," one of them said, choosing her words carefully. "We have waited so long for the Americans. It has been hard for us." "Not you, but us, lady," a surly GI answered. "Go back to your Nazis." The 2 nuns looked blankly at each other and jabbered excitedly in German. Our convoy rolled on into the center of the town, and we were surprised to find that we were the first American troops to enter Dernbach. The armored spearheads had stayed on the Autobahn, bypassing the town. The civilians gathered curiously around our trucks and talked rapidly and in low tones to one another. I designated platoon sectors. A truck from battalion rode up and down the main street, collecting prisoners as the men unearthed them in their search for billets. My second platoon sent word that a German soldier was in bed in one of their houses, claiming he was too sick to be moved. I went to investigate and found the soldier in an upstairs bedroom surrounded by members of his family. He claimed that he was at home on sick leave from the army. I jerked back the covers of his bed. His shirt had been replaced by a nightgown, but he lay in bed wearing the trousers of a German soldier. The women sobbed violently as we hustled him outside to a waiting jeep. Battalion transmitted an order from regiment that no soldier would be billeted in houses with civilians. The regimental CO was making a strict interpretation of the Supreme Headquarters Directive on non-fraternization. I transmitted the order to the platoons, and the streets were soon filled with disconsolate civilians moving light household goods to the homes of their neighbours. 3 middle-aged women who occupied the house which we chose for the company CP began to sob violently when Harms told them they must move. They took my hand and pleaded earnestly to allow them to live in one room of the house. I tried to act tough, but my youthful face must have betrayed my efforts, and I felt peculiar inside. I could not avoid thinking how I would feel if invading soldiers were chasing my own family into the streets. But then, these people had asked for it. "Tell them to get the hell out," I told Harms, and I turned and left the house. There was one advantage in not being able to speak the language. I could leave the dirty work to my interpreter. The 1st Platoon CP group were the proud inhabitants of a 2-story villa with a crude bathtub and shower in the attic. Battalion was occupying the more modern sector of the town, as we had come to expect, and the other houses which we occupied did not possess even indoor toilet facilities. Bagby invited me over to take a bath that evening. As I waited my turn in a line of grimy men from the platoon, we consumed a bottle of rich red wine which persistent GI searchers had looted from its carefully chosen hiding place in a niche in the cellar wall. Regiment directed a training schedule the next morning, and I assembled the company for close-order drill on a sloping green hill on the edge of town. The varied uniforms, with marked contrasts of laundry and pressing, emphasized the mockery which we felt for this type of work when we had the opportunity to rest. Tomorrow we may be fighting the Germans again. Today we are doing close-order drill. Damn it! We moved unexpectedly the next day by trucks, only to wait long, chilly hours under overcast skies by the road, as rear elements of the armoured division ahead of us tied up the roads. Oftentimes we were within sight of the wide ribbon of concrete that was the Autobahn, with sparse traffic speeding along the highway. Rumour spread that the Autobahn was in the 3rd Army sector, and by command of General Patton its use was restricted to gasoline vehicles of the 3rd Army. Even that was not enough to convince us that it was necessary to hustle and bustle to cross an IP, initial point, at a given time, only to spend long hours waiting by the roadside later. Hurry up and wait! GIs joked to drivers of passing single vehicles. Is your trip really necessary? The side highway which we followed changed into a dirt road, dusty from hundreds of heavy vehicles, and the Autobahn disappeared in the rolling hills to the southeast. The column progressed in leaps and bounds, sometimes no more than a few hundred yards at a time. The soldiers invariably dismounted, building small fires by the roadside and heating K-rations over the flames. Darkness came, and with it the chill of evening. The bonfires of troops ahead marked the route which we were to follow. As night fell, we could see the orange flashes of artillery on the horizon, and the sounds of their firing told us that the war was not far away. I made out the outlines of fighter planes on an airstrip through the inky blackness. A small town with burning buildings indicated that here the advance elements had met resistance earlier in the day. Fires burned in the next town, but we turned to the north on the edge of the village, and the fires died away to our rear. The column slowed to a virtual halt and manoeuvred to avoid being crowded into the ditch by a column of American tanks with dim cat's eyes glowing in the darkness. We picked up speed again. 3 miles farther, we pulled off the road into a grain field and dismounted. It was 11 o'clock. This was our destination for the night. Our guide, Sergeant Donald Jenkins, a former schoolteacher from 7 Mile Run, PAR, met us at the road as we moved from the field. He was our battalion billeting guide and had arrived only a few minutes before the main convoy. The town was Altenkirchen, a backwoods farming town which Sergeant Jenkins described as a cow town. It was only 36 miles from Dernbach, yet we had travelled all day. The town behind us, where we had met the tanks, had been the scene of bitter fighting by a bypassed German garrison. We moved down the dark street to the area designated for our billets. Sergeant Jenkins waved his arm at the general area, and I hastily divided it into platoon sectors. The sleepy men began to hammer loudly on closed doors with harsh commands to "Open up, you German sons o' bitches." Sleepy civilians appeared at the doors, only to join their excited comrades a few minutes later in moving about the dark streets to find neighbours' homes which had not been invaded. Harms gave the occupants of our prospective combined CP and kitchen 10 minutes to leave. The terrified civilians made it in 5. The rough order system seemed to be what we needed. Not only had the houses been evacuated rapidly without argument, but a partially full bottle and another untouched bottle of choice cognac had been left on the table beside the bed which Sergeant Henderson designated for me. The kitchen had supper ready by midnight. We would leave the next morning at 7 o'clock, and the company must be fed again before leaving. The kitchen force prepared for a sleepless night. I checked to see if all platoons were billeted properly and went to bed at 2 o'clock. We had fried eggs for breakfast, the first in months. The order for movement was changed 3 times during the morning, each time seemingly at the last possible moment, and it was noon before our column finally moved off down the road. After 3 miles, we reached a river with a partially blown bridge and a town on the opposite bank which bore the marks of heavy shelling. The enemy had evidently attempted a stand on the river line, but the armoured dreadnought had rolled on. The second day of travel was a repetition of the first, except that the ride seemed colder and the halts seemed even more frequent. A column from the 80th Division of the Third Army somehow became entangled in our column, and it was hours later before the situation was set right. Here and there we passed a town that showed signs of an attempted fight, but for the most part the towns were unscathed. An occasional enemy vehicle with littered papers and equipment sprawled beside the road. Callow German youths looted vainly through the rubbish. Occasionally we saw a dead Wehrmacht soldier, his skin turned a sickly green in death. Empty K-ration cartons and C-ration tins littered the shoulders of the roads, and German children searched vainly for chewing gum and cigarettes through rubbish that had been searched countless times before by others like them. In the scattered intervals when the convoy moved, we passed an occasional group of Frenchmen, Poles, Russians or Belgians, who would wave their arms violently and shout hoarsely, their fingers upraised in the V sign for victory. "You Ruski!" the GIs would shout from the speeding trucks, and the liberated slave labourers would shout happily in return, "Polski, Francais, Belgique," or "Ya, ya, Ruski." MPs at intersections or GIs standing beside the road came to accept the cries as well. The soldiers on the trucks would shout to a harried MP, "Ruski." The MP would answer, "Ja, Ruski," or "Mit Deutsch." German civilians watched apathetically from windows and balconies, or hurried about their business. This American army had been rolling by for hours now. The dust and the roar of motors had become routine. If you displayed a white flag on your house, that was all that was necessary. Buxom Frauleins became accustomed to passing shouts of, "You schlafen with me?" and some kept their eyes to the ground and hurried on, while others looked up and laughed. Rumoured reports on the rapid advance of the armoured spearheads filtered to us at every halt. We were 10 miles behind the front when we started out, but we were 40 or 50 miles behind now. Hell, we might never catch up. Passing men from rear echelon units lining up for evening supper with mess kits and in neat regulation uniforms brought jeers and derisive laughter from the infantrymen. Hell, Corps headquarters was in that town. Geez, we're rear echelon bastards now. Again, the autobahn with its speeding traffic appeared on our right. How we longed to move out on the big four-lane highway and join the rapid flow of unimpeded traffic. But our convoy halted within sight of the highway, and we watched the vehicles speed by. Darkness seemed to signal the slow-moving column to speed up. The trucks sped and careened dangerously over the small, curving highway, each driver trying desperately to keep the dim tail lights of the preceding vehicle in view, his own visibility reduced to almost nothing by the blackout driving. If we were to do most of our travelling at night anyway, I wondered why they didn't allow us to wait until night to begin. At least we could sleep in the daytime. But the column was held up again in the middle of a dense fir forest. I learned that a truck was stuck up ahead where exploded mines had destroyed the road. We shivered for 2 hours in the damp, chill darkness. When we finally moved off again, we progressed only a few hundred yards. A soldier with a flashlight stood by the road, directing the trucks to turn off into a cleared space in the woods. It was midnight. The colonel had decided to bivouac for the night in the woods. The men cursed. "With all the goddamn towns around!" A group of 15 Germans was waiting by the road to be taken prisoner when we had finished breakfast and moved out again the next morning. We bypassed rear elements of the armoured division, and some unknown priority allowed us to move on the autobahn. It was a thrill to speed down the wide ribbon of concrete after the slow riding over the side roads. The autobahn was lined with displaced persons and former slave labourers making their way toward our rear. The men on the trucks tossed cigarettes and chewing gum from K-rations to them. They scrambled madly for the prizes, and then the winners raised their hands toward us in an enthusiastic V sign for victory. We turned off the autobahn to the northeast after 20 miles and followed a dusty country road through thick woods that had evidently been a large German ammunition dump. Ammunition of all sizes and calibers was stacked in small piles throughout the forest. We neared our destination and passed through a cow town occupied by Company 1. The men waved cheerfully at me as we rolled on through the town. We crossed a hill with a white flag fluttering in the breeze and came upon the dilapidated little farming town of Denenrod beyond the hill. The billeting detail met us in the centre of the town. "What a deal this was," Sergeant Jenkins said. "We rode through town in our jeeps, and then we saw 2 German soldiers in a house on the far side of town. When we came back through, there were Germans everywhere waiting to give up. We were the first Americans here, 9 men. We took 109 prisoners. We hoped that we would not stop here for the night. It was the poorest town we had encountered, and it was only midday. We set up the company in the old houses, however, and the kitchen put the final touches on the noon meal. The orders came after lunch. We would move on. We moved comparatively rapidly, even though we did not see the autobahn again, arriving at our destination at 4 o'clock. It was another small farming town, Sliden, but more modern than Denenrod. My company CP was set up in a small brick bungalow near battalion headquarters, and we attached the electric lights of the house to the captured German generator which battalion carried. Colonel Smith warned me that we were on the left flank of the First Army's left spearhead, which had joined with the Ninth Army to trap thousands of Germans in the Ruhr pocket. There were rumours of a German attempt at breaking out of the pocket, and we would be directly in the path of such an attempt. I should plan my defences accordingly. The first platoon fortuitously drew the choice billets again. One of the houses had a modern bathroom, and I accepted Lieutenant Bagby's invitation to a bath. That made my second bath in less than a week, and I was beginning to tire of the frequency. The next day was April 1st and Easter Sunday. Chaplain Anderson, the regular 2D Battalion Protestant chaplain who had also conducted services for the 3D Battalion when I was with them, held the Protestant services in a large hay barn next to the battalion CP. Men of Catholic faith were provided transportation to the town which regiment occupied. We moved the next afternoon at 1 o'clock, 18 miles to Mengeringhausen, a large town that would provide ample billets for all of us. G Company was assigned a sector on the northern edge of town. Captain Bird, the operations officer, called me the next morning to send out a combat patrol of approximately 1 platoon, supplemented by a machine gun section, to comb the woods to the north for enemy stragglers trying to escape from the Ruhr pocket. He sent an overlay by runner of the route the patrol should take. I decided to go with the patrol and called the 3D platoon to assemble at the company CP. The 2 jeeps arrived, and we mounted the 2 light machine guns on the anti-aircraft mounts. The men from the platoon crowded into the 2 trucks. I rode in the lead jeep with Private First Class Roy Shepard, SCR 300 operator, who would keep us in touch with battalion in case we ran into too much trouble, and the gunners for the machine gun. Our driver was Private First Class Clem E. Todd from Georgia. The 2 trucks followed, and the other jeep acted as a getaway vehicle in the rear under Staff Sergeant Savino Soniger of Gonzales, Texas, the machine gun section sergeant, and Staff Sergeant John Day, the 3D platoon guide. We moved slowly along the road for 2 miles until we came to a crossroads. A lone stone house stood at the intersection, the dense fir forest stretching behind it. 2 Frenchmen ran from the direction of the house, waving wildly for us to stop. "SS! SS!" they shouted. "SS!" I halted the column and dismounted to talk with them. They were forced labourers working for the farmer who lived at the crossroads. They said there were several German soldiers who lived in the woods during the day and came to the farmhouse for food at night. 3 of them had been at the house and had run as we approached. Their insistence that the Germans were SS troops worried me. Sergeant Barnes motioned for his platoon to dismount, and the men took up an extended formation on either side of the road. They moved off toward the woods, and I followed closely behind in the lead jeep, the machine gunners alert for trouble. The lead scouts found the 3 Germans a few yards inside the woods, waiting submissively to be captured. Instead of SS, they were 3 elderly men from a Wehrmacht Labour battalion. Lieutenant John W. Whitman of Renovo Par, the 2D platoon leader, who had been on pass to Paris, had rejoined the company when I returned from the patrol. He took over the command of his platoon, and I shifted Sergeant Patton to take over the 3D platoon. Sergeant Barnes outranked him, but Patton had been recommended for a commission that should be through at any time. The 2 non-coms were close friends, and neither objected to taking orders from the other, and Sergeant Barnes had consistently refused a commission. Staff Sergeant Walter A. Cantwell became Lieutenant Whitman's platoon sergeant. Lieutenant Bagby called the CP to tell me that his platoon CP had come equipped with a bathtub again, but sorry, no water. I was called to battalion after supper for a company commander's meeting. The battalion was alerted for movement the next day. It looked like trouble. The armour had met stiffened resistance on the approaches to the Weser River, and the 23rd Infantry would attack. We were to move the next morning at 8:30. It was 11:30 before our column pulled out. The sky was overcast, and the weather was dreary and cold. A lone German fighter plane flew high above the column, but alert anti-aircraft machine gunners held their fire when the plane kept its distance. We reached a small village hidden in a valley, guarded by a line of high hills on the horizon. I learned that this town had been the limit of advance until today, when our 3rd Battalion had attacked up the highway leading across the towering hills. It was night when the 3rd Battalion finally captured the large town of Hofgeismar from a determined garrison of SS defenders. Colonel Smith ordered me to go forward and take over a sector for defence from Company 1. Rain and cloudy skies had brought an early darkness, and we could see only a few feet ahead of us. Our column moved across the hill and down a tree-lined highway toward the town, past fallen branches and occasional gutted houses standing gaunt and ghostly against the dark horizon. Fires were burning in Hofgeismar. We pulled the trucks up beside a series of large stone buildings that looked like army barracks. I dismounted and began to look for someone from Company 1 whose position we were to take over, but the darkness was inky black and I could see no one. A tracer bullet from a sniper's rifle whistled over our heads, tracing a burning red pattern through the blackness. I called the platoon leaders into a building, and we looked at the map by flashlight. We were in the right location. I designated defensive areas, and the platoons moved out. Lieutenant Loberg, my executive officer, located a clean portion of the barracks to serve as our CP, and the men settled down on hard German army bunks for the night. Lieutenant Bagby called over the 536 radio. "I haven't got a bathtub this time, Captain," he said, "but we've got a mighty attractive Fraulein and a cellar full of champagne and cognac. Want to come over?" When morning came, the sun was not shining, but the rain had stopped. I received a call during breakfast to report to battalion as soon as I had finished. I found the colonel in an upstairs room with a clear view of the rolling hills to the east. The other company commanders arrived, and we spread our maps for the order. F Company would attack at 9 o'clock to take the next town to the east, Karlstadt. The 1st Battalion would then advance to Karlstadt, passing through F Company to attack along a road to the southeast. E Company would also pass through F Company, moving to the northeast to take the town of Hombressen. G Company would follow in reserve closely behind E Company. I returned to the company and gave the order to the platoon leaders and returned to battalion to await the outcome of F Company's attack, overjoyed that we had drawn the reserve company position for today's action. Fox Company found no resistance in Karlstadt. From the vantage point in the battalion CP, we could see the head of the column, which was the 1st Battalion, moving out from Hofgeismar toward the town of Karlstadt. Someone pointed to 3 dark spots on the forward slope of the hill beyond the distant highway. "There are tanks up there," he shouted. "Take a look with the glasses." A puff of smoke came from the nearer object on the hill. Dirt cascaded beside one of the trucks in the column. There could be no question now. The dark spots on the hillside were German tanks. "They're Mark IVs, someone with field glasses said. The other 2 enemy tanks began to fire, and the shells ripped up the dirt around the vehicles in the column. At any moment, one of the tanks or tank destroyers or one of the trucks loaded with soldiers might be blown to pieces. The tanks and TDs stopped and turned the muzzles of their guns toward the menace from their flank, opening fire. The trucks sped around them and raced toward the cover of the buildings in Karlstadt. Shells burst to the right and left and forward and rear of the speeding trucks, but I saw no hits. The inaccuracy of the enemy fire was hardly believable. An explosion from close outside the building shook the house. 3 tank destroyers had pulled up beside the house and were blasting away at the enemy a mile away on the hillside. The tanks and TDs on the road seemed to realize that they had help. They turned again toward Karlstadt and raced toward the town. The Germans followed their paths with shells, but the tanks and TDs went unscathed. The shells from the TDs firing from below the window where we watched churned the earth around the Mark IVs, now manoeuvring on the hillside like bugs on the surface of a pond. A sudden burst of orange flame sprang from the nearer tank, and flame and smoke billowed up. One of the TDs had scored a direct hit from over a mile away. The 2 remaining Mark IVs beat a hasty retreat into the obscurity of the woods beyond the field. The show was over. We left our reserved seats in the window of the house. It was our turn to run the gantlet to Karlstadt. I followed close behind the last truck in E Company's column in a company jeep driven by Private First Class Joe Rowe of Oklahoma, watching the left flank apprehensively for the return of the German tanks. As we neared Karlstadt, the vehicles ahead of us pulled to a halt. The lead trucks had evidently stopped in the town to unload their GI cargoes, not realizing that they had left my company exposed on the open road to the mercy of the enemy tanks should they choose to return. I told Rowe to pull around the last E Company vehicle and move on into town. A wrecked jeep stood beside the first house on the sloping hill that led down into the main part of the little farm village. One GI sat erect in the back seat. A companion hung limply over the steering wheel. The marksmanship of the enemy tanks had not been as poor as I had thought. The jeep had absorbed a direct hit. The occupants were dead. I heard tank fire behind me, and I realized that the Mark IVs were firing again, this time at the rear trucks that were carrying my men. Rowe drove as fast as possible on the narrow road with the line of E Company trucks on the right, and my column reached the safety of the town unscathed. I found the head of the column and contacted Colonel Smith. E Company would continue the attack immediately down the main highway to Hombressen. The highway ran on the floor of a narrow valley walled on either side by sharply rising wooded hills. F Company would place men on either side of the valley to prevent an ambush, and I would follow E Company towards the objective. At the junction of streets in the centre of Hombressen, E Company would go to the right, clearing the southern half of the town. G Company would take the left fork, clearing the northern half. Our role as reserve company had been short-lived. A section of 81 mortars under First Lieutenant Jim Rainey of Pasadena, Texas, was set up beside the highway on the edge of Karlstadt. An artillery observer called for fires on the objective, and the 81 mortars added their crunching explosions to the roar that echoed up and down the narrow valley. We moved down the highway with single columns on either side. A man from E Company met us bringing 2 Germans in black SS uniforms with their hands resting on their heads. Neither of the Germans could have been over 16 years old. The town proved to be infested with snipers, but there were no other defences. It was a long, tedious process, clearing the snipers from the houses and barns, and the minutes wore on into hours. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon when the last sniper was cleared from the sector. I called the platoon leaders and assigned their locations for defence until we received further orders. I hoped that we could spend the night in the town. On the hill to our right front, we could see the lead tanks of E Company's column move out of Hombressen toward a gently rising wooded slope to the east. The lead tank was halfway up the slope when an explosion came from the woods, and a shell ripped up the dirt to the right of the tank. The soldiers riding on the tank jumped to the ground, but the tank kept moving. Another explosion came from the woods, and the tank burst into a sudden, hideous, orange-coloured mass of flame. Isn't it funny how you feel sorry for a wounded tank, as if it had a human sense of pain? The other tanks turned back toward the town. I did not know what was happening, but meeting the fire from the woods had evidently caused a change in plans. E Company did not press the attack up the hill. The afternoon settled down to a drowsy quiet. Civilians straggled back into the town from the woods beyond where they had gone to take refuge from the shelling. The information that the Americans had arrived and there would be no more boom-boom must have spread quickly. Technical Sergeant Samuel D. Dillard of Woodruff, South Carolina, the platoon guide of the 3rd Platoon, came over to my temporary CP to invite me to a feast of eggs. I accepted with pleasure. The platoon had found a basketful of eggs. Their preparation would have won no blue ribbon for sanitation, but they tasted good. I must have eaten 5, and the men from the platoon were gorging themselves. They seemed happier over finding the eggs than they would have been had they found a cellar full of cognac. Private First Class Leon W. Fulton, one of my radio operators who had only recently returned from his 2nd trip to the hospital from wounds received in action, came over to the platoon to tell me that battalion was calling. It was Major Vern L. Joseph, the former exec with the 3rd Battalion, who was now with the 2nd. He was with the battalion rear CP and was relaying a message from Colonel Smith. "This is Joseph, Mac," he said. "There's been a change in plans. You're to hold where you are until relieved by the 38th Infantry. Load on their trucks and move back to Karlstadt. I'll have a guide meet you there." My questions for further information were denied. He did not want to give any more information over the radio. Officers from the 38th Infantry arrived shortly on reconnaissance, and the troops were not far behind. I talked with the officers. "I understand your outfit is crossing the Weser tonight," one of them said. I was shocked. Then that was our mission, establishing a bridgehead across the Weser River. If there was any main line of German defences between the Rhine and the Elbe River, it would be the Weser. Visions of flaming tracer bullets from a dug-in enemy across a river as we assaulted in a night attack flashed before my mind. We had had it easy for a while now. Tonight we would get the works. The big trucks rolled swiftly over the narrow highway, but the race against darkness was lost. It was dusk when we arrived at the town of Wackerhagen on the west bank of the Weser. My battalion radio was able to pick up the forward CP again. "Have you eaten yet?" Colonel Smith asked over the radio. Not yet, but I understand our kitchen is set up here ready to feed us now. Eat as quickly as possible, the colonel continued. Then load up with all the ammunition each man can carry and at least 2 days' supply of K rations. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Roger. There are guides at your kitchen to show you where to find the boats. Come on across. Come on across, just like that. I swallowed. What's that, sir? I asked incredulously. Across the river, the colonel said again. A guide'll meet you on this side. E and F are over here already. The news was startling, but I was relieved. I wanted to jump and shout with joy. So there would be no night assault against the river line. We would move across without opposition to a bridgehead already held by friendly forces. It was almost too good to believe. The men formed quickly for supper, but complete darkness had fallen before we finished the meal. The night was damp, misty, and dark. Major Joseph had explained the crossing of the river to me. The 1st Battalion had gone through the woods to Weckerhagen with little resistance, and when there seemed to be no opposition on the other side, they radioed the information to regiment. E Company was having trouble beyond Hombressen, so they pulled E and F companies out and shoved them across in assault boats. The Germans hadn't fired a shot. 1 man was killed and another lost a leg when our own artillery fire fell short after they reached the town of Hameln on the opposite bank. It was the First Army crossing of the Weser. Our guides led us down a muddy back street to the river. It lay stretched before us, a wide, misty expanse of swiftly flowing water. We could not see the opposite bank in the darkness. As we reached the river, we heard a short burst of small arms fire far in the distance. The guides had missed the point where the boats were supposed to be, but a search up and down the slippery bank revealed their location 200 yards to the north. A group of small landing craft was drawn up on a section of gently sloping shoreline. We could hear the muffled sound of oars from other boats making the trip across the misty water to the other shore. Men spoke in muffled undertones. My men loaded onto boats, and we moved across. The engineer crewman guided us easily, allowing the small craft to drift with the swift current until it approached the opposite shore. Other boats were disgorging their cargoes upon the muddy riverbank. Waiting hands reached out for a line tossed from our boat and pulled us up on the sloping bank. We jumped quickly ashore. A guide from battalion headquarters was waiting for us beside a house near the water's edge. We waited for the other men of the company to arrive, and the guide led us up a narrow street into the town and pointed out our billets on either side of the street. The guide said, "The colonel wants to see you right away. I'll show you to the CP." I found the other company commanders already assembled at the battalion CP when I arrived. We exchanged greetings around. "Spread your map here on the table," Colonel Smith said. "Here's the situation." He pointed to the map. The map showed that beyond the town of Hameln, the ground sloped gently upward until it reached a point approximately 1 mile from the river. There, the contour lines on the map formed almost a solid black smudge, indicating that the ground rose abruptly into cliff-like hills. The highway leading east from Hameln made 2 hairpin curves after it reached the densely wooded hills. A patrol from F Company had already gone as far as a farmhouse at the first curve, but had been fired upon. That must have been the small arms fire we heard at the river. It was obvious that anyone holding the commanding hills to the east could easily pinpoint any object that moved in the valley on either side of the river. The Germans evidently did not yet know that we had crossed the river, but the patrol skirmish at the farmhouse made it clear that they would know by morning and would set up defences on the high ground, unless— I looked at my watch. It was almost midnight. I suddenly realised that I was dog-tired from the nervous tension of the day, although the fighting had not been stiff. Christ, how I wished we could wait until morning. "Fox Company will lead out," the colonel said. "You'll follow with George Company, and I'm holding easy here in reserve. God damn E Company, they always get the breaks. Fox Company will dig in on the high ground beyond the first curve. You will either break off from the tail of the column and go cross-country to the second curve, which is almost abreast of the first one, or pass through Fox to the second curve. If there are any krauts there, which I doubt," he continued, They won't be expecting you. They blew the bridge across the river here, and evidently figured it'd be some time before we could get boats up to get across. A car full of German officers came barreling into town right after we arrived, and F Company's Negro platoon was holding the road into town. I think every one of them got a shot in. Those Krauts didn't know what hit them. The men from F Company were waiting for us when I reached the east edge of town with my company. The column moved out, men walking silently on either side of the road, their heavy boots and rattling equipment betraying their efforts at secrecy. Captain Calhoun had found a civilian automobile in Hamelin, and since there would be no transportation until the engineers could bridge the river, he brought it along to transport his heavier weapons. It seemed to make enough noise for a column of tanks, and I was glad when it ran out of gas halfway up the hill and had to be abandoned. I was not afraid. At least I had no overwhelming fear to make my body tremble as I remembered from the pillbox positions, but instead a deep underlying dread of the unknown which posed question after question in my mind. What was ahead of us? What the battalion staff officers did not seem to realize was that it was rough even when you hit no opposition. Your nerves were keyed to such a pitch that it was a relief sometimes to run into trouble. We reached the point where I thought we should turn off the road to go cross-country to the second curve in the high hills above us. I dropped back to the rear of the lead platoon, remembering my folly in the woods at Ondenval. The men jumped the ditch on the left of the road and stumbled across a gently rising ploughed field until we reached a line of underbrush and trees which marked the abrupt ascension of the hillside. The men ploughed noisily through the dense underbrush. I cautioned those around me to be quiet, but there was no stopping the muffled curses as branches slapped men in the face, or sharp thorns tore at exposed hands and faces. The side of the hill was almost perpendicular, and I found myself pulling up by the bases of small trees. The climb was slow and fatiguing. Sweat popped out on my body beneath my field jacket, and I wanted to take it off, but there was no time. The blanket roll slung over my shoulder became heavier and heavier. The single file of men ahead of me stopped, and a call was passed down the line for me to come forward. I bypassed the men, and they dropped quickly to the ground, grateful for the opportunity for a brief rest. Lieutenant Whitman was at the head of the column. He had halted on a small trail which seemed to wind around the hillside. He thought it was time we had reached the highway and wanted to check with me to see if my map showed this trail leading to our objective. 2 men held a raincoat over me, and I spread out my map and scanned it hurriedly by the light of a dim flashlight. The map showed no trail. The hill continued high above us. The underbrush looked to be more dense than that through which we had already passed. The trail to the right ran downhill in the direction of the highway we had left originally. "This isn't it, Whit," I said. "Looks like we should have reached the highway by now, unless we turned off the road too soon. I believe we must be too far to the north." Whitman agreed. It seemed that our best bet was to take the trail to the right and follow F Company, passing through them when they stopped at the first curve in the highway. The lead men picked themselves up slowly, fatigue evident in every movement of their bodies. I knew they were cursing me for leading them up the hill only to descend and have to climb it again. Nothing ever seemed to go right in the infantry. We caught up with the rear elements of F Company just as they reached the farmhouse. There had been no fight. The Germans who had fired on their patrol earlier in the evening must have withdrawn. F Company's rifle platoons were going into position around the first hairpin curve. I talked with Captain Calhoun to decide on a point for my right flank to tie in with his left. I knew from my memory of the map that my 3 rifle platoons would be stretched to the limit to cover the wide area between his left flank and the second curve. The platoons scrambled up the hill beyond the highway to find their positions for the night. The 2D platoon would defend the second curve. I was wondering how much farther it was to the curve when it came suddenly into view. It didn't have the appearance I had expected from the map, but I couldn't be mistaken. The map showed only the 2 hairpin curves. I could see by the luminous dial on my watch that it was 4 o'clock when the platoons finally were all placed for the night. I shivered in the chill night air and moved with my CP group a few yards down the slope from the highway. There was no sound of shovels digging into the earth. We would probably be here only for a few hours until daylight, and the men were evidently too tired to dig in for that length of time. One by one, the members of the CP group fell asleep until I was left alone with Private First Class Warren Bock, the 19-year-old weapons platoon runner from Pittsburgh, PA. I wanted to sleep too, but fear of the unknown and my responsibility kept me awake. Bock and I walked up and down the road to keep ourselves warm. The minutes ticked slowly by. I wondered what would happen if a large German force should move down the highway toward us to take up defences on the hill. They did not know we were here, but my men could hardly be classed as a serious obstacle to anyone's advance. They were dead tired, and most of them would be fast asleep. And there were no dug-in defences. In the distance from the east, I heard the sound of heavy motors. Tanks! Enemy tanks! The thought went through me like an electric shock. We were not at the top of the hill by any means, and enemy tanks could sit at the crest and shoot us off like sitting ducks. And where were our tanks? They would be sitting on the other side of the wide Weser, unable to cross until the engineers finished a bridge, probably not until late in the afternoon. Oh God! What if the sound of the motors did indicate tanks? Please, dear God, don't let them be tanks. The sound of the motors died away. I yearned for a cigarette. Bock woke Junior to take his place on guard. I awoke Citrone, my runner, and we walked toward the farmhouse 200 yards down the hill. The house was battered from artillery shells that had plastered the area after the F Company patrol was fired upon. 6 different men challenged us as we made our way to the house. When we were inside, I hastily lit a cigarette and looked at my map. One glance at the map was enough to tell me that my company was in the wrong location. The curve, which was now our left flank, showed on the map as a short twist in the highway. We were only halfway between the 2 hairpin curves. I hurriedly smoked a second cigarette, and Citrone and I headed back for the company. Faint streaks of dawn were beginning to give a dull grey tinge to the surroundings. Since it was so near daylight, I decided not to shift the platoons to the north until we could see where we were going. The minutes until dawn seemed like hours. The night was still and quiet. I heard the beat of feet approaching on the highway from the left, followed by the muffled voices of several people. The guard heard it too, and we dropped to the ground. The footsteps came nearer. I held my .45 pistol ready. Perhaps the 2 D platoon guards had fallen asleep, and a German patrol had slipped through on the highway. We could see an assortment of figures approaching us. The figures came abreast of us on the highway, and I dropped my pistol. There were 3 women, 2 men, and several children jabbering excitedly in a language I did not recognize. I decided they were Russians. They passed from sight around the curve in the highway. Dawn was approaching faster now. I awoke the CP group, and they took their unopened blanket rolls to continue the move. Citrone went with me to the 2 D platoon at the twist in the road, and we found men sleeping in the ditches. I asked Sergeant George Sable of Chicago where I could find Lieutenant Whitman, and he led me to him. I told Whitman we had made a mistake and should continue to the next bend in the highway and take up defensive positions until further orders. I moved back down the highway and contacted Sergeant Patton and gave him the same information. He prepared his men to move. We followed a small trail which led to the 1st platoon on the right. Lieutenant Bagby was already awakening his men. I gave him the information and turned to go back toward the highway when I noticed 2 figures in a clearing 100 yards up the steep hill in front of the platoon position. They seemed to be picking berries from a bush. "Have you got any men up that far?" I asked. "I don't think so," Bagby answered, looking in the direction I pointed. "Why, those are Kraut." Staff Sergeant Hartwell York of South Portland, Me, one of the 1st platoon squad leaders, levelled his rifle at the 2 Germans and called out, "Kommen Sie hier! Kommen Sie hier!" The Germans looked toward us. They seemed not to have noticed us until Sergeant York called to them. I thought I could see them shrug their shoulders, and they turned slowly and walked into the woods. 2 of the men started to shoot. "Don't shoot yet," Lieutenant Bagby said. "You might start something. 2 of them can't do us much harm." Citrone and I moved back toward the highway. As we came abreast of the 3D platoon, Private First Class Umberto R. Rodriguez of Tampa, FLA, stepped out on the trail, driving before him a German soldier with his hands high above his head. "This bastard just wandered calmly down the hill," Rodriguez said. "He says he's out on patrol with two of his buddies." I looked up the hill. The two Germans whom I had seen in the clearing in front of the first platoon were sauntering casually down the hill. They saw us and stopped. Rodriguez motioned to them to come on down the hill. The two Germans held a hasty consultation between themselves and casually turned and walked slowly back up the hill. I could have sworn I saw them shrug their shoulders indifferently. "Good Lord," I said. "These guys are absolutely nuts." "You take this one for me, Captain, and I'll go get the other two," Rodriguez said. He motioned to two men, and they started up the hill. Citrone motioned the green-clad soldier to move down the trail. He started forward in a slow shuffle. Citrone kicked him solidly in the rear, and the soldier turned slowly and looked at us blankly. Just as slowly, he turned again, and with the same slow shuffle moved down the trail. I looked at Citrone, and he shrugged his shoulders. Citrone said, "Maybe he doesn't know there's a war on." We found the CP group waiting for us beside the highway. Harms questioned the prisoner. He said he and two of his fellow soldiers had been sent out on patrol to find the American positions. They were members of a Labour battalion which had been moved up the night before to halt the Americans at the Weser River. They had found the Americans already across, however, and now their outfit was digging in around a town beyond the woods to our front. He didn't know whether his outfit had any tanks. I called battalion, and Captain Bird said to assemble all prisoners at the farmhouse, which was serving as F Company's CP. Rodriguez came down the trail to the highway with the other two Germans. "These guys must be balmy," Rodriguez said. "They act like fugitives from a nut factory." A flurry of small arms fire sounded around the curve on the left flank. I listened intently. The 2D platoon had run into trouble. I tried to get Lieutenant Whitman on the radio, but the batteries were getting weak and the distance was too great. We walked in the direction of the firing, Citrone calling at intervals for the 2D platoon over the radio. A series of rifle shots sounded up the hill in the direction of the first platoon. Citrone contacted Lieutenant Bagby. "We're moving on up the hill and toward the curve," he said. "We got within sight of the highway where it bends back and ran into a Kraut patrol on bicycles. They wouldn't give up, so we had to take care of them." "How many did you get?" I asked, unaware that I sounded as if I were speaking of birds. "There are 5 of them." Citrone tried again to contact the 2D platoon. The radio sputtered, and Sergeant Cantwell, the platoon sergeant, answered. "What's the situation?" Citrone asked. He was so short and funny-looking and sounded so authoritative when he asked the question, I laughed. I heard another flurry of small arms fire from the left. "We were walking down the highway," I heard Sergeant Cantwell say over the radio, "when we ran into a bunch of Krauts hiding behind some stacks of firewood." Another flurry of small arms fire sounded from our left, but Sergeant Cantwell's voice did not seem in the least perturbed, rather amused. "The bastards are yelling at us to surrender now," he said. "They say they've got us surrounded, stupid son-so bitches." The 3D platoon broke into the conversation. It was Sergeant Patton. "Hello, G6, he said. "This is G3. We can see Whitman and are moving in on his flank. We'll let you know how we come out." "Roger," I said. We continued down the road to the left around the curve which I had thought in the darkness was our objective. The road curved then gradually to the left, and we could not see the men from the 2D platoon, although the firing sounded nearer. We came upon the spot where the platoon must have first come under fire. Their blanket rolls were scattered along the road where they had dropped them hurriedly to go into action. I heard 3 more shots from the direction of the 2D platoon. Sergeant Cantwell called over the radio. "I think we've taken care of 'em now, Captain," he said. "We're moving on to the bend in the road. Killed 6 and got 3 prisoners. Too bad it had to end this way when they had us surrounded." Sergeant Patton called for the 3D platoon. "Make that 2 more prisoners from the fighting 3rd. Roger." The battalion radio sputtered, and Abad said headquarters was calling for me. Hello, Able-3, this is Smitty. Get your men set to move out. I'll be up shortly. Our objective is the first town past the woods. You'll be on the left of the highway with Fox on the right. We jump off at 8 o'clock. Any questions? I started to tell him we had been attacking already since 6 o'clock, but I decided that perhaps it would be best if he didn't know that we hadn't reached the objective last night. No questions, I said. Roger. Out. F Company joined us at the second hairpin curve in the highway. I formed my company in the woods on the left side of the road, with the 2nd platoon leading the assault. The 3rd and 1st platoons were echeloned to the left rear to protect the wooded flank. Colonel Smith radioed to ask if we were ready, and I looked at Captain Calhoun, who nodded in response. I signalled to Lieutenant Whitman, and the lead scouts stepped boldly into the underbrush. We will now take a short walk in the woods for the purpose of nature study. Please excuse our silly walking formation. We were raised in an army camp. My map showed that the first likely spot for an enemy defence was a north-south highway, which met the road we were following at a crossroads in the woods, almost a quarter of a mile distant. There might be enemy patrols between us and that point, but the crossroads seemed the only logical defensive position until we emerged from the woods at a point overlooking the town of Ellershausen, slightly less than a mile away. Our orders were to hold up at the far edge of the woods to await the completion of the bridge across the Weser and the subsequent arrival of tank support. I tried, but I could not put the memory of the heavy motors I had heard during the night from my mind. The harsh memory of riflemen against tanks in the grueling Ardennes battle was stamped indelibly in my mind, and I could not avoid the overwhelming fear of meeting the Germans on such terms again. The riflemen ploughed slowly through the woods, hindered by the dense underbrush. I followed close to the highway as it continued slightly south of east after making its last deliberate turn at our starting point. I pushed around a thick bush and found a tangle of bicycles and human bodies on the ground. The bodies were German, and their faces were rapidly turning a sickly shade of green that seemed to blend with their uniforms. "Must be the patrol the first platoon hit," someone said impassively. "Lieutenant Bagby's men sure got far enough up the hill." One of the dead Germans had his lips pulled back, baring irregular teeth in a sickening snarl. The eyes of another stared blankly at me. A thin trickle of blood from the temple of another appeared to be still warm. I wondered why the Germans turned green so quickly after death, and remembered that someone had once said it was due to a diet deficiency. A report came over the radio from the 2nd platoon. They were coming out of the underbrush now, but they were still in the woods. So far, no trouble. So far, I thought. They should be reaching the crossroads soon. Colonel Smith and Captain Bird came abreast of me on the highway. "Call your men out of the woods to the highway, Mac," the colonel said. "There's nothing here. That's pretty obvious. Move them over to the road where they can make some time, and let's get going." I looked at him dubiously. I wanted to scream and ask what in hell was all the all-fired rush about, but I turned to Citrone and told him to get the 3 rifle platoons on the radio. "Hello, G2?" Citrone began. "Hello?" A sudden burst of small arms fire echoed through the woods ahead of us. Bullets whistled overhead. I dropped instinctively to the ditch beside the road. The small arms fire was so intense that I could not distinguish between German and American fire, but I wondered why so few bullets whistled over our heads. Whitman and his men must be laying down quite a volume of fire. There was no need to ask him if he had reached the highway. It was obvious that he had hit the German defences there. I had fallen behind when I stopped to talk with the colonel, so I motioned for the CP group to follow, and we moved up the ditch toward the sound of the firing. I looked around for the battalion staff, but I could not see them. "Humph, nothing in the woods," I said to myself. The road curved slightly to the left, and I could not see the crossroads, but I knew that we must be near. The ground had levelled out. We had at last reached the top of the hill. The firing stopped almost as suddenly as it had begun. A few scattered rifle shots remained. "Call Whitman," I said to Citrone. "Ask him what's happening." Citrone called for G2. "We've come up against a bunch of kraut dug in beyond another highway," Whitman said. "Looks like they've got quite a trench system. Do you think you can move forward?" "We'll try it with marching fire," Whitman answered. "I think so. Cantwell has been hit. Not too bad, but you'd better get a litter and we need some ammo." "Roger?" Abad, carrying the battalion radio, contacted Captain Bird. "We'll get a litter squad right up," he said, "and we'll try for ammunition. No transportation but F Company's auto, but I'll send it back." I sent 2 men to the weapons platoon to collect all M1 ammunition they could spare. It was not enough. I sent them back to get any spare ammunition from the 1st platoon. The barrage of small arms fire began again, with the same rapid crescendo as before, echoing back and forth through the woods. The picture of what was happening in the woods a few yards from me was clearer now, even though the low-hanging branches of the trees obscured the view. The Germans were given very little opportunity to fire their weapons. The platoon was laying down such a terrific barrage of fire that the Germans were forced to keep their heads down in their trenches. The 2nd platoon riflemen would be jumping up and running forward one by one, hiding here behind one tree, hiding there behind another, while their comrades fired and awaited their turns to move forward. The firing suddenly stopped again. I noticed the litter squad kneeling in the ditch behind me. Whitman sent a man to the highway to guide the litter bearers and bring the ammunition. 2 of the aid men moved forward in a half-crouch and entered the woods, their red crosses against a white background on their helmets glistening as they moved. A burst of small arms fire came from the right of the highway. The enemy's line must extend to the right as well, and F Company had run into trouble. Whitman's platoon started to fire again, and the woods crackled with the sound of the firing. The aid men emerged from the woods carrying Sergeant Cantwell on a stretcher between them. I stood up to talk to him. "I'm sorry as hell, Captain," the sergeant said, and I could see that he was making an effort to keep his face from showing the pain he felt. "Just got in the way, I guess." "Nice going, Cant," I said. "Hurry back to us." He had a painful wound in the side, but the aid men thought there was no danger. 2 men from battalion headquarters arrived with their arms full of bandoliers of .30 caliber M1 ammunition. I sent it back to be distributed among the 1st platoon and told the men from battalion to bring us another load. At the rate Whitman's platoon was firing, we would need several loads before we reached Ellershausen. "Send the litter squad back," Whitman called. "I've got 2 more men wounded." Fulton ran back to overtake the litter squad. The 2 men returned with him and re-entered the woods, emerging a moment later carrying Private First Class Carby J. Simpkins, who was wounded in the upper leg. Private First Class Herbert Verflam walked with them. He had been hit in the left shoulder. Both men had been hastily bandaged in full view of the dug-in Germans by the courageous platoon aid man. Captain Calhoun was just across the road with his forward CP group, and we decided it would be best to coordinate our next assault to reach the crossroads at the same time. Thus, neither company would be endangered by enemy fire from the flank after reaching their respective portion of the enemy position. He said he would order his platoons forward when they heard Whitman's men open fire again. I radioed the information to Whitman. The sudden fusillade of fire from the woods came once again, and I knew that Whitman's men were endeavouring to make this their last assault. F Company answered with a small arms barrage on the other side of the road. The rapid fire was sustained and then slowed down gradually until I could hear only scattered shots. "We've crossed the highway," Whitman radioed. He was breathing heavily. "Patton's on my left. We're going on." I signalled the CP group and the weapons platoon forward, and we moved the few remaining yards to the crossroads. The woods beyond the north-south highway became a dense forest of big firs. German dead and equipment were scattered in and around a series of trenches which zigzagged back and forth beneath the heavy branches of the fir trees. The damp red earth piled high in front of the trenches showed that they were freshly dug. 5 wounded Germans in immaculate uniforms, except for bloodstains here and there, screamed and moaned for medics. A German officer, still wearing his officer's cap with its shiny black visor, saw as we passed that I was an officer. He called to me for help and pointed alternately at a decoration on his blouse and a bleeding wound in one leg. The decoration must have meant something, but I did not understand and was revolted at his appeal to me as a member of the officer class. We passed on. There was no time to care for the stupid officer. The aide men in the rear would care for him in time. Small arms fire sounded again to the front. Whitman had run into trouble again, and the noisy chatter of small arms fire told me he was pulling no punches. "They're trying to hold up at a fire break," he radioed. "Patton's platoon's up beside me now. We can handle it okay?" I wanted desperately to go farther forward to where I could see what was going on, but I knew it would be necessary for me to be almost atop the forward rifleman before I could see anything through the dense woods. I remembered again the folly of moving too far forward the night I was wounded. I contented myself with cautioning the CP group to be alert for snipers that the lead platoons might bypass. The firing stopped to the front, and I knew that the second platoon was pushing forward again. Captain Calhoun called over the battalion radio. His men had come upon a 200-yard clearing on the right of the road. The woods beyond would most probably be defended, and he wanted permission to move his company through my sector. It offered concealment all the way to his objective. I said, "Roger," and saw his men move across the highway ahead of us. I radioed Lieutenant Whitman that they were coming through our area. I reached the fire break where the lead platoon had met its second resistance. 2 dead Germans lay as they had fallen, but there were no foxholes or trenches. We passed through a few more yards of dense trees before we came abreast of the clearing on the right of the road. The route in our sector offered only slightly more concealment, and I could see the last of F Company's assault platoons moving up and mingling with my forward elements where the woods became dense again. The intervening space was carpeted with high grass and ferns, but the majority of the trees had been felled. Scattered rifle shots and the occasional staccato chant of a bar came from the woods beyond the clearing on F Company's side of the highway.